This is your spoiler warning. This video will contain spoilers. Anything past the intro is spoilers. Basically everything is spoilers. Anything past the intro is spoilers. The video is spoilers. This is spoilers. If you don't want to be spoiled, click off now. I guess. I don't fucking know. And on a more serious note, this video will also contain references to more sensitive topics like suicide, self-harm, depression, post-traumatic stress disorder, and other mental illnesses, so there's your trigger warning. But yeah, I'm gonna go to sleep because it's 5 a.m. and this is the last edit I'm gonna make on this audio. Bye. Omori released on Steam on Christmas of 2020 as a psychological horror game after almost 10 years of delays in development hell, and right now is sitting as one of the most critically acclaimed psychological horror games on Steam, only topped by Phasmophobia and DDLC. The body of this video will be split into 3 different parts: the gameplay section, the combat section, and the analysis section. I think this game is pretty good. I think there's a lot of downtime, and I've seen a lot of people say that the game could be compressed or made a lot shorter, but I feel like even with all the downtime, it does help the build-up and the climax. It's not completely useless. It does have a point. It's a pretty good game, if not a bit long. In my book, it's definitely an 8 or a 9 out of 10, and I hope you can empathize with my rating by the end of the video. But yeah, I do think the length of the game definitely contributes to the story the game is trying to tell. And by this I just mean the fact that, like, by the end of the game, you can understand why the game is as long as it is. But even if the length of the game is justified, I can definitely still understand how it'd be too much or too long for some people. But I'm getting away from the point here, so I digress. But yeah, let's just start the video, I guess. Ever since the game was announced in April of 2014, one of its main selling points has been that the game is not as innocent as it appears to be, and that a lot of the gameplay leading up to the release of the game was very misleading. So much so that up until 2017, where Omocat released another trailer for the game, none of the horror elements or the horror gameplay had really been shown yet. So it shouldn't really come as a surprise when the gameplay loop of the game involves a lot of innocent RPG gameplay. You know, a lot of exploring, killing bosses, doing puzzles, but in between all that, especially when transitioning to a different chapter, you'll see a lot of horror elements or a forced horror scene, and between those things, you'll also find Easter eggs or references to more creepy or disturbing topics. So this loop of RPG gameplay, horror sequence, real-world gameplay, RPG gameplay, that essentially continues up until the last third of the game, where you can see the climax start building, and the idealistic innocence that the game has been portraying so far starts to fall apart, and it just becomes a full-on horror game in the last third of the game. And with the way the game paces this transition, it really helps you put yourself in the shoes of Sunny or Omori. You can see the cracks in his mind get bigger and bigger and bigger, and he eventually has to confront his demons. He has to confront the things that he fears and wants to repress. And the game just does an incredible job of displaying this through the gameplay. One thing I noticed is that this game isn't really meant to be fun. The game is fun, the combat is fun, however, the gameplay is meant to service the story and your understanding of the narrative more than it is actually be entertaining and engaging, or even fun. And that's not to say the gameplay in Omori is bad, or it's boring, or it's disengaging. My point is that fun factor isn't exactly a main pillar in Omori's gameplay. It isn't the main point. The point of the gameplay is that it's mostly there to service the narrative and your understanding of the story, rather than to just be like dumb fun, or entertaining for the sake of being entertaining. Though it is still pretty fun. Just like fun factor is more of a side thing, it's not the main focus of it. And this does really benefit the narrative, as throughout the game, you can only really find clues of what's really going on, especially near the end of the game where you're completing the hangman minigame. You can look into the holes under the letters where they previously were, and see glimpses into black space and Sunny's repressed memories. But you never really know, you only have hints or clues, which is why I say that the game does a really good job of putting you in his shoes, because you never really know, right? You're learning at the same pace that Sunny does, which is what I mean when I say you and him start to share thought processes. A great example of this would be in WHITESPACE, where most of the player base thought they had to kill the cat, cut open his stomach to get the key to exit the room and progress the story, when in reality that's not what you had to do. But you did it anyway and committed an act of violence for essentially no reason. There was no prompt or no hint showing that you had to kill the cat and get the key out of his stomach. We just immediately thought that. And I think this is great because it shows how the game essentially makes something like that a compulsion, just something normal. Okay, I get in this room, there's a cat right here, I need a key. The key's obviously going to be in the cat, but it's not in the cat. And it's meant to show how fucked up that thought process is and how the game has normalized that for you and made it regular and made that thought process seem rational, logical, and just seem completely sensical. The game asks you like 7 times before you open up the cat if you really want to open up the cat. Then there's nothing in the cat, and then you just have to stab yourself. And what I love about this is that it gives you a moment of clarity. It gives you a moment to think, what the fuck? This is so weird. Like, why did I do that? Like, it gives you a rare glimpse of normality and logic here in this weird place, which is great. I love it. It's genius in my opinion. It really lets you see how irrational and nonsensical that thought process is. It's like, what the fuck? What are you doing? That makes no sense. Why'd you do that? That's super weird. And this moment of clarity that you have after the scene is just as reflective of the player as it is of Sunny, as it's these little moments of clarity that you gain throughout the game that eventually build up into the climax and you actually confronting your repressed memories. Because by acknowledging these repressed memories, you gain even more clarity. So as a result of the predictability of the gameplay loop, the game does end up being kind of boring with the amount of downtime it has between each horror sequence. And so a lot of the game is just taken up by RPG shit until like the last third of the game that ends up being like 99% horror shit and it just turns into a full horror game. But the narrative does actually benefit from this downtime. And it's not for any complicated or nuanced reason, it's just for the fact that it gives the game a lot of time and space and maneuverability to develop the world and the characters and really give you a grasp on his headspace, on Sunny's headspace, so you just further understand the rest of the game and the 1/3 horror near the end. But you'll usually only realize this near the end of the game or when you actually finish the game, because a lot of mundane or small things might seem pointless in the short term, but by the end of the game you can see the significance in them and why they're important to the rest of the story. Even if they're not key parts in understanding the narrative, they just help build the world and make it seem all the more consistent. But between downtime, you do have the horror sequences in the game, such as when you wake up in the middle of the night. Whenever your house is dark, that means there's a horror sequence. Or if you do the hikikomori route, where you just stay inside every time you have the option of going outside, you'll also get lots of horror sequences. And these are all paced very well. It never feels like the game is giving you too much or too little. You know, when the game starts to get boring, the game will throw you a bone and you have something to chew on, something to think about. You know, you're wondering how certain things connect to other things. It's just something to think about during the more mundane parts of the early game. The early game is still very fun and can be enjoyed independently, but the horror sequences in between are also very good supplementary material while the plot progresses and you learn more about the world and get more attached to these characters and understand them better. But so far, all references to gameplay have been tying into the narrative in one way or another. So what I'm about to talk about, which is exploration, should be a bit of a break from all the story shit. Exploration is kind of rough early game, like before you complete the story. Depending on the ending you get, you can unlock more content. If you get the ending where Sunny kills himself to live in the headspace forever, you'll actually live as Omori forever, and you'll unlock a shit ton of more content, like new areas, new bosses, like just a bunch of new content, man, it's insane. But before you actually complete the game, you can only really do side quests or odd jobs to earn more clams and all that, and sometimes fight new enemies. It's kind of scarce, but the majority of the exploration comes post-game once you get that specific ending. And there's a shit ton of more content, like I said, bosses, quests, areas, and lots of lore stuff and like secrets you can do to learn more about the world and the story. Like WHITESPACE 2, the Red Room, all that shit. Once you get that ending, which is ironically one of the most depressing ones, it becomes a very lighthearted RPG, you know? It feels kind of like Earthbound. Yeah. that's the end of the gameplay section. I do want to do a little story time quickly. Earlier today, I was showing my friend the previous recording of this that I did like 6 months ago. I knew it was mixed badly, but it was so horrible that I just had to redo this entire section today. And right now at 5 a.m. I was just like checking over everything and editing a little bit to make sure everything was fine. The mix on it was just so terrible that I had to redo the entire thing. In one day too. Last time it took me like a week to do the entire thing. I added some new bits too. Some new information, some new ideas that I had. So yeah. I'm gonna go edit the intro, because in the intro I said that the gameplay section is fucked up. And it was so fucked up that I fixed it, so it's no longer fucked up. So, yeah, it's, next section is combat. Omori was very inspired by games like Undertale and Earthbound, so as a result, this game obviously has a turn-based combat system, including all the basics of any turn-based combat system, like a health bar, a mana bar, skills that require mana to be used, and certain characters with different abilities. For example, Kel is meant to be a more aggressive, combative type character, while Hiro is meant to be more of a healing type character that you really only use to heal the rest of your team. You can also find items you can equip on each of your characters, like weapons or charms, that might grant a variety of different abilities. Some have less damage but more defense, or vice versa. But it's not just damage or defense, there are like 20 different statistics that it affects. Luck, agility, etc, etc. I'm not gonna list all of them. I'll put a picture up on screen. There's also the emotion chart, which plays a big role in combat. You can inflict certain emotions upon your team and your enemies, which have different effects depending on what you choose and what you have to work with. If you want to see how these emotions play a huge role in combat, I'll put the chart up on screen, but I want to pause for a moment to focus on the symbolic meaning of the chart. Originally, I had like an entire 3-minute section of me explaining the symbolic meaning of the emotion chart, but there's an excerpt on the wiki that explains it a lot better than I ever could, so I'm just gonna read that off. The emotion chart foreshadows how the main group coped with Marty's death in the real world. Sunny became deeply traumatized to the point of being incapable of fully expressing emotions, as the event led him to spend 4 years alone repressing his memories, hence why his emotion is represented as neutral. After joining the hooligans, Aubrey developed feelings of anger towards her old friends, as she thought they had abandoned her and moved on too quickly from Mari's death. This led her to become a violent, short-tempered delinquent in the present. Kel still retained his happy, optimistic demeanor by making new friends, playing sports, and trying to find happiness in others. Hiro went into a long state of depression for a year, shutting himself away and being unable to do anything until Kel managed to help him get his life back on track. Basil became a nervous wreck, and even more so in Sunny's presence, terrified that the truth of Mari's death would somehow resurface. So yeah, Sunny became deeply depersonalized due to his 4 years of self-isolation, loneliness, and trauma. Aubrey began to deeply resent her old friend group for, in her eyes, not taking Mari's death as seriously, when in reality, the rest of the group held the same amount of guilt and grief that she did. Everyone just had different coping mechanisms. Kel was obviously saddened by Mari's death, but never let it get a hold of him. He quickly found new activities and new people to find happiness in. Hiro and Basil went into essentially big depressive episodes, especially Basil as he participated in the crime, and prefers to avoid Sunny as to not remind him of the incident. It's also worth mentioning that Aubrey bullied Basil at school, as she was under the impression that Basil scribbled out all the faces in the photo album, which would obviously contribute to the resentment Aubrey has for her old friend group and contribute to Basil's depression. A big issue I have with the combat in this game is that you have to fight cannon fodder enemies to level up, and if you don't, then by the time you get to the bosses later in the game, you'll be way too low level to win.
Comment me on you. Kel, since you're the lowest, I'm going to sacrifice you to the gods. I need you to get your brother back. I need him full. Wait, when did I not? No!
Now this itself wouldn't be a problem if the game didn't let you skip every single fight ever. This could be a me problem, as I'm kind of a novice when it comes to turn-based RPGs. This is my first turn-based RPG since Danganronpa, but it still felt really annoying having to reset to a checkpoint before the boss fight just to kill a bunch of enemies and wait for them to spawn in to get to a specific level, then go fight the boss. This could be a design flaw on Omocat's part, or I'm just dumb. I have no idea. But that's not to say you can run away from every enemy in this game. In the underwater highway, there are many enemies that you have to fight no matter what, even if they're not bosses. But these enemies give you no XP at all. If they actually gave you good XP, then I wouldn't really be complaining. So yeah, great combat system, a twist on the traditional turn-based combat system, some annoyances, like the ones I just mentioned, having to fight cannon fodder that isn't technically forced on you, but still an overall great and fun combat experience. On to the next section, analysis. Excuse my voice right now, I am sick. But before we begin, let's go over some basic prerequisites. The first of which I don't really have to elaborate on. Omori obviously takes place mostly in Sunny's mind. There are real life sections, but most of the game takes place in Sunny's mind. And the real life sections that are in the game are meant to contextualize the rest of the game, which takes place in Sunny's mind as Omori. Speaking of Sunny's mind, the environment which the game takes place in is typically referred to as headspace. You spend a lot of the game in headspace. Headspace is meant to be an idealized version of Sunny's childhood memories. You can see that in the real life sections, everyone looks older and more physically mature. This is because the versions of these characters that we see in headspace are from when Sunny was 12 years old, before the incident with Mari had even happened. In comparison to headspace, everyone in real life has a completely different appearance, with some exceptions. Headspace is also very childlike in appearance, with very palatable colors, like blue, green, and purple all over the scenery, all to represent that this is an idealized version of Sunny's adolescence. Another thing to note is that a lot of the enemies you fight in this game are personifications of your own trauma, like the something variants. That's what this game is about, fighting through personifications of your own trauma to defeat your traumas, to defeat your fears, to eventually heal and recover. Hence why at the end of the game, once you conquer all of your fears, you have to fight Omori. You have to kill off that part of yourself that wants to repress and lock away all your traumatic memories. If Sunny wants to discover the truth, he has to kill off Omori. That's all I've got for prerequisites, so let's actually start this part of the video with plot contrivances. Everybody's favorite. So the plot contrivances within Omori aren't actually significant enough to significantly change our analysis of the narrative, but depending on how you interpret them, they might change how you view the narrative. Plus, they're just interesting to go over. Keep in mind that these are very much up to your own interpretation, and these are your own opinion. Whatever opinion you might have is pretty well supported by the community, like there's a good basis which you can predicate that opinion on. There's no opinion that's like obviously wrong or obviously right. Like whatever interpretation you take usually isn't wrong. Everyone can take their own interpretation. I'll just be explaining the viewpoints and my opinions. So everyone obviously has different opinions, but the two main ones are this. The first one is Sunny and Basil are kids. How could they have possibly conceived the plan to frame Mari's murder as a suicide? They don't even know what suicide is. They don't know what hanging is. They're just innocent little kids. Now you can take whatever interpretation you want of this, but one thing you have to remember is that kids are very impulsive and lack a lot of empathy due to their underdeveloped brains. So if they know what suicide is or if they know what hanging is, it is very much within the possibilities that Sunny and Basil could commit or conceive of such a sinister act. But this is all up to your interpretation. In my opinion, it's a little exaggerated, but it's not that unrealistic that kids could commit such an act. Especially if you're 12 and having a mental breakdown over this. Not to say if you weren't 12 you wouldn't have a breakdown over this. Anyone who kills their sister on accident is gonna break down. If you go through all the different endings and different routes in the game, you'll see that Basil also has a problem with suicide ideation, similar to Sunny. So maybe there's a reason why she knows how to tie a noose. Just something to think about, you know, food for thought. Also, like, it's a video game, bro. Hop off dick. If you can't suspend your belief for 2 seconds, I don't know what to tell you, bro. You're really not that important. The second one pertains to, how don't Sunny's parents know that he killed Mari? So the first interpretation of this so-called contrivancy is the one that I personally hold. which is that Sunny's dad is aware of the fact that Sunny is the one that killed Mari, but refuses to tell the rest of the family. And due to the disgust of having this knowledge, abandoned the family, without ever telling his wife, Sunny, or anyone else. There's also the idea that maybe his mom also knew, but doesn't tell Sunny as to not worsen his condition. And his father just couldn't take the disgust of having to take care of his son that killed his daughter, so he left. And his mom had the same information that his dad did, but decided to stay to take care of Sunny. She could handle knowing Sunny killed Mari and still take care of him, but maybe the dad couldn't. But before I get too ahead of myself here, I'll explain why I'm even entertaining the idea that Sunny's parents, or one of his parents, might know that he killed Mari. So, if we take a look at a specific area within Black Space 2, the Black Forest, and go through a corridor that can be located on the top left of the map, or obtain the final correct key you need to complete the Hangman minigame and interact with the hole, you'll be greeted by a narrow corridor which leads into a small area. Entering this area, we can find a man chopping down a tree, which we can assume is the same tree that Mari quote-unquote hung herself on. We can also assume that the man chopping down the tree is Sunny's father, via context clues and information found by data miners in the game's files. So, allow me to explain how this ties back into my original point, and how this can help support the argument that either of Sunny's parents might know that he killed Mari. If you interact with the man, he'll say, "Stay away, you are not my son." And if you decide to continue the dialogue, he'll end it off with, "Why? Why won't you fall?" Obviously talking to the tree. So from this, we can extrapolate 3 different interpretations. Or at least 3. I should emphasize that you can take whatever interpretation you want of the information I'm about to give you. These are just my picks on the most logical and the most sensical interpretations I've seen.
What's up, guys? Entrusted from the future here. I just paused the video real quick to say that here I say that I'm going to go over 3 different interpretations, but I actually only go over 2 because late into the making of this video, I realized that the 3rd interpretation was stupid and didn't make that much sense. At the end of this section, I'll explain why that 3rd interpretation didn't make much sense, but I figured I'd just let you guys know so people aren't in the comments like, "He said he's gonna go over 3 and only went over 2. So yeah, continue.
The first interpretation is that this dialogue is Omori trying to trick Sunny into thinking his parents know he killed Mari and they hate him for killing Mari. Now this is a sensical interpretation because it is in Omori's best interest to feed the flame that keeps Sunny's fear for his past alive, as the only reason that Omori exists is because Sunny fears his past. If he didn't fear his past, he wouldn't need Omori to repress it and run away from it. Omori is essentially fear-mongering Sunny. The second interpretation is that the reason Sunny's dad is saying, "You're not my son," is because he's talking to Omori. Omori isn't his son. Sunny is his son. No pun intended. He doesn't claim Omori as any part of his family because Omori isn't his son. At best, he's a hollow representation of Sunny. All the charm, personality, and everything you could possibly like about Sunny is hollow and gone from Omori. Omori is a shell of Sunny. You can see this in the color scheme that he uses. He's black and white. Extremely simple, extremely plain, no complexity. Omori is all the worst parts of Sunny. And Omori's not even Sunny. He's just Sunny's coping mechanism. He's his shield. So why would Sunny's dad claim him as his son? But we'll get to the colors later. At worst, he's a representation of everything bad, wrong, or out of order in Sunny's mind, trying to work against him to maintain order. That's one thing you need to remember. No matter how polarizing these 2 personalities that I just described are, they're both working to keep order in headspace. They're both working to maintain the equilibrium that is white space and its contemporaries.
So before we move on from plot contrivances, I'm going to explain to you guys quickly why I didn't include that 3rd interpretation in the video. And usually I would freestyle the dialogue, but I want to make this much more concise. So I'm just going to read you guys what I wrote. These are my 3 interpretations. The first 2 are the only ones I elaborated on. My 3rd interpretation is highly unlikely as Sunny is an inherently unreliable narrator. Despite the stark differences between the real life and headspace sections, Sunny, for a large majority of the game, is working against himself. He seeks to punish himself for his role in Mari's death, and repress any memory of what occurred on that day. A good example of this is the erasure of Basil's bedroom door after you discover her corpse in the Hikikomori route. Another good example of this is his distortion of his relationship with Aubrey, where Aubrey is clearly very protective of him and implicitly has a crush on him in Headspace, while in real life, it seems to be that Sunny has the crush on Aubrey, not the other way around. Given that Sunny is an inherently unreliable narrator, it's difficult to believe that any narrative he tries to tell us, the player, in relation to the incident or especially what happened after, could be true. Hence why the strange man hacking at the tree is more than likely a result of Sunny's guilt.
So now that we've gone over all the possible plot contrivances, it's time to try and diagnose Sunny. So Sunny is very difficult to diagnose, as Sunny suffers from disassociation, which is very clear throughout the game, and disassociation is a very vague blanket term for several different mental illnesses, but I'll try and draw the line in the sand today. One thing we can say about Sunny is that he certainly suffers with some form of amnesia. The entire point of the persona Sunny created in his mind, Omori, is to forget. And amnesia typically occurs after traumatic events, like being complicit in the covering up of your sister's killing. So many people online have theorized that Sunny has dissociative amnesia and certain parts of his memory have gaps in them to prevent him from having to deal with the emotional stress that would come with confronting the fact that you killed your own sister and were complicit in the covering up of this killing. Dealing with these things, especially at such a young age, is extremely difficult. I don't even think I have to elaborate on that. So naturally, Sunny doesn't want to deal with these things. He wants to lock them away. That's Omori's job. That's Blackspace's job. To make sure these repressed memories and these traumatic events don't come up to the surface. The surface being the rest of Headspace. Even including space, which is the space between white space and black space. Literally just space. Black space is meant to represent the amnesia, the parts that he's trying to forget. At one point in the game, Daddy Longlegs even states, "So, the dreamer took on another name and chose to forget himself." This is referring to how Sunny chose to take on the persona of Omori and forget what happened, to forget himself. We see this even in the real life sections where Sunny refuses to speak. I think in the entire game he has maybe 5 pieces of dialogue. Probably less, actually. Now this is referred to as selective muteness, but all you need to understand is that Sunny is a shell of his former self. He doesn't like to speak, he's very quiet, and Omori is largely responsible. He chose to forget himself for Omori. Now to be clear, what I'm diagnosing Sunny with here is dissociative amnesia, not schizophrenia. A lot of people confuse the visuals in this game for schizophrenia because in the real life sections, Sunny will often hallucinate black space imagery, but this does not mean that Sunny is schizophrenic. Schizophrenia does not result in the creating of new identities, like Sunny did with Omori. Omori is a representation of Sunny's disassociation. It's his dissociative state. It's the identity he relies on as a dissociative amnesiac. Omori is the tool he uses to repress his memories, and Omori protects Sunny by keeping him in white space. So now that we've explained Sunny's mental condition, or tried to at least, and ruled out other disorders like schizophrenia, let's find out what white space, black space, and red space really mean within the context of the game. So white is meant to represent Sunny's disassociated state. It's meant to represent innocence, something non-offensive, something that doesn't trigger, something that feels safe for Sunny. This is why white space is so harmless. White space is where Sunny spends most of his time. It's completely white, there's nothing that could possibly trigger Sunny in it. And black space, where all of Sunny's repressed memories and triggers lie, is black, the opposite of white. So white is a very safe color, just like how white space is a very safe, non-triggering, non-offensive area. Black, on the other hand, is the opposite of white. Black space is very chaotic and contains all of Sunny's worst fears. Notice how all the something variants are all black? That's because black is meant to represent the trauma, the repressed memories that Sunny doesn't want to remember, the things that make Sunny uncomfortable, uneasy, the things that make Sunny want to turn back to Omori. Now last, but certainly not least, red. Red is meant to represent the day that Sunny killed Mari. It could also be interpreted as a signal of truth, or honesty. You could also interpret it as a method of guilt, but for the sake of simplicity, just think truth, or a callback to the day that Sunny killed Mari. If it's a little too vague to understand now, trust me, as we get through the video, you'll understand. One of the easier to understand ways that the game illustrates this symbolic meaning is in the prologue before you fight your first fear, where there's a window radiating bright red that you can interact with at the top of the stairs. If you interact with the window, you'll get a prompt that says, "An eerie red glow radiates from outside. You feel strangely drawn to it. The strangely drawn to part is meant to symbolize how no matter how much Omori tries to repress the memory of what happened on that day, Sunny will always seek it. Sunny will always seek the truth, which is why Sunny and Omori have to fight at the end of the game. Sunny is looking for the truth, while Omori is attempting to hide it. Now, it is worth mentioning that there are parts of the game where you play as Omori, but they don't take place in headspace. If you go to the deeper well and interact with the branch coral, he'll tell you that Basil is in another world, which implies that black space or white space aren't a part of this world, aren't a part of headspace. You can even see it in the graphic of headspace. At the top we can see space and a lot of other areas, but where are black space and white space? They're nowhere to be found. If you recall the prologue of the game, Basil was actually in the prologue, until she quote-unquote disappears or goes missing. At the beginning of the game, when you go to Basil's house, she drops a photo from her photo album, which when she picks it up and sees the content of the photo, she has some ominous dialogue before disappearing, and Omori's teleported back to white space. Right before we're teleported back to white space, we can actually see the photo that Basil saw, which is a photo of the broken violin. The violin that broke when Sunny pushed Mari down the stairs, killing her immediately. What this flash frame implies is that Basil saw something she wasn't supposed to see, a clue relating to the incident that could help Sunny remember what happened on that day. So seeing that Basil got immediately transported to black space, which we know because the original entrance to black space is through Basil's house, we can assume that Omori has some degree of control over headspace/white space. Because the moment that Basil finds a clue relating to the incident, she's immediately banished from headspace, which Omori would obviously do so Sunny doesn't remember the incident. Omori's goal is to keep Sunny in a constant state of ignorance in relation to the incident. Remember that for the rest of the video, or any other video you watch on this topic. Given this, it makes complete sense why Sunny was immediately teleported back to white space, his sanctuary, his safe space. Omori didn't want him seeing the banishing of Basil, so he sends him back to white space as a form of repression. White space is where Sunny goes to disassociate. It's his safe space. If Omori allowed himself to witness the banishing of Basil and the creation of that black hole that sends her into black space, then it could break the facade that holds together headspace and the cycle of repression. But it's not just Omori trying to keep up this facade, it's the other characters too. We can see that before you enter black space, Aubrey tries to convince you not to go in, because Aubrey is an agent of headspace, and her job, being a part of headspace, is naturally to keep Sunny away from the truth, which we know black space is full of if you played the game. Another thing to mention is how Aubrey refers to us as Omori, but right before we go into black space, we find Basil watering her tulips, and she refers to us as Sunny, because Basil, having been banished from headspace, isn't a part of headspace anymore. So we can see in her dialogue, she speaks much more introspectively about Sunny as a person, and even tells us a little bit about white space in general. She talks about how her white tulips aren't very flashy, aren't very flamboyant, they're very safe and comfortable. She even compares them to Sunny. I used many of these same adjectives, or synonymous adjectives, to describe white space. Now I know I'm hinging very heavily on the white tulips part, but this game does hide everything in everything. Whenever you go a layer deeper, there's another 10 layers for you to explore. And with the word choice used in this dialogue, I think it's safe to say that this is an allegory for white space. By the way, throughout the entire duration of the game, Basil is also not on the combat chart. This isn't really that important to mention, but I just thought it was a cool detail. So the next thing I want to talk about is the meaning of certain fights in the game, specifically the something fights. Now originally, I was going to go over all the something fights individually. However, the anti-penultimate boss in the game, something, is a combination of all the individual boss fights. And there's even 2 extra phases that help better explain my point. So let's start off with the first phase. The first phase is just the something. There's no particular fear here, it's just something. It's a blanket personification of Sunny's trauma. Something could be anything, it's just a something. However, this is only the first phase of the boss. This is only the first part of Sunny beginning to reconcile with himself and forgive himself for what he did. So now we can move on to the second phase, which is named Something in the Dark. You actually fight this something in the prologue when you try going down the stairs and the hand catches you. This version of something is meant to represent your fear of heights. Near the beginning of the game, when you make it to the Lost Library, one of the books of interest actually explains to you Sunny's phobias and fears in just one short story. A story of when Sunny and his friends jumped off a statue into a nearby lake, using the statue as a diving board. After everyone had taken turns jumping off the statue into the lake, they eventually convinced Sunny to go up to the statue and jump into the lake. Now, as Sunny is preparing to jump off the statue and into the lake, he already feels anxious, but his anxiety reaches a crescendo when he sees a spider on his shoulder and throws himself into the lake, in the process having to be saved by Mari from drowning. Now, with this story alone, I don't even have to explain Phase 2, Phase 3, or Phase 4, since all of Sunny's fears in this boss fight are covered in this one short story. The spider that crawls up his shoulder explains his arachnophobia. His near-death experience where Mari had to save him from drowning explains his fear of the water, not to mention his fear of heights, since he jumped off the statue and had to be saved by Mari from drowning. I'd be afraid of heights too if it led to a near-death experience, especially in the water, bro. I know this is like super off topic, but drowning is definitely the worst way to die. Anyway, now that you understand all of Sunny's phobias, his arachnophobia, his fear of heights, and his fear of drowning, or more generally, his fear of the water, we can move on to the next two phases, the fifth phase and the sixth and final phase. So both phases are actually very similar. However, I think they both represent two different things, so I won't consider both of these phases one phase. However, you can. Plus, the wiki separates them into two phases, so I'll use that. So in the fifth phase, you can see a figure in the middle of your screen swaying in the wind. We know this because whenever Sunny uses any of his skills, the dialogue says, "Something sways in the wind." As you progress with the boss fight, this figure is unblurred to reveal what looks like a hanging body that could only be Mari's body. Only after conquering all of your fears, your fear of heights, your arachnophobia, your fear of drowning, you get to the fear that's at the center of it all, Mari's death. And even then, you need to persist and overcome to unblur Mari's body and reveal what truly happened. After overcoming all of your fears and finishing the boss fight, you're transported to black space, where you can pick up a light bulb being shined on by a white light. Now this is important because to initiate the boss fight, you have to break the black light bulb in white space. And the black light bulb actually has a symbolic meaning. In a lot of movies and different kinds of media, light bulbs are meant to represent the creation of an idea. And if light bulbs are white, then a black light bulb must represent the repression of an idea, since black is the opposite color to white. Hence, when you face the something boss, where you face all of your fears, it happens right after you break the black light bulb, right after you break the symbol of repression inside of white space. Once you break that symbol of repression, you immediately begin to face all of your fears. Anyway, that's pretty much all I have to say on that. Let's move on. Real quick before we move on, I want to go over an interesting scene after the boss fight. After being transported to black space and picking up the light bulb, you're transported into this dream-like scene, where we're greeted with a pathway leading to Basil sitting under a tree. Now the dialogue we have with Basil here is actually very important, as we see Sunny have a dialogue with Basil, where Basil tells him to continue fighting and to be strong. Obviously, this is a dream scenario. Basil isn't actually telling him this. However, this is a manifestation of Sunny's subconscious mind. His subconscious desire to defeat his trauma manifests as Basil. Basil is Sunny's subconscious mind speaking directly to him. Anyways, for what should be the final time, let us continue with the video. A common theme in Omori's horror sequences that you'll often notice is isolation. Isolation plays a key role in Omori, as it helps to represent how Sunny feels alone in facing his problems. This is very clearly illustrated by the fact that none of the horror sequences ever include any of Sunny's friends. In the boss fight we just spoke about, you are completely alone. It's you versus something. This applies to all the other something boss fights in the game. You never have anyone else to help you. This is because it's Sunny's choice to accept the truth. Nobody can accept it for him. He has to decide whether he wants to confront the incident or not. If you water Basil's flowers on 2 days left, you can get a secret post-credit cutscene that illustrates my point perfectly, where Sunny and Basil are in the hospital together, and you can see both of their somethings slowly fading away. We can see that Basil has a something too. Both Sunny and Basil have a something inside of them. They have trauma relating to the incident that they have to battle. Only after Sunny defeats something and compiles all the photos for the photo album that tell the full story of the incident, do Sunny and Basil actually fight each other's somethings and defeat them fully. I mentioned earlier that something's design is based on the last look of Mari that Sunny got, which is Mari's right eye peeking through her hair while her corpse swings in the wind. You can see at the end of the game that Sunny has a big bandage wrapping his right eye, symbolizing the killing of Sunny's something. Another thing I wanted to point out, but it couldn't really fit into the video, is that Sunny scribbled out all the photos in the photo album. However, Basil took the blame for Sunny, so Sunny wouldn't be shunned by the rest of the group. Sunny scribbling out all the photos in the photo album was just another way for him to repress his past and try and deal with his grief. It was just another way to forget Mari. In a minute, you'll realize why this minute detail is so important for the next part of the video, where I want to go over some of the final sequences in the game and demystify a lot of the symbolism in them, to make a lot of the concepts that we've spoken about up to this point much easier to grasp. And as a result, the game itself will become easier to grasp. Once you know what to look for, understanding Omori basically just becomes pattern recognition. Now, almost directly after defeating all of his fears, Sunny goes on a quest to complete Basil's photo album, seemingly fulfilling some kind of promise that he has with Basil. Regardless of this, as you collect more photos and add them into the photo album, Sunny becomes progressively bloodier, even to the point that blood is trailing him from bleeding. And as we know, red is meant to represent truth. As you uncover what happened and discover the truth of the incident, you become increasingly covered in blood. Covered in red, which is another way of the game symbolizing that you're getting closer to the truth. Even the backdrop to the photo album itself is red. Red is everywhere in this part of the game, and it'll only get more abundant as we go on. In this next scene, Sunny comes across a sliding door that's radiating red, but before he can go through it, he has to screw in the light bulb that he found beforehand into the lamp, which reveals a room with a couch chair and a photo for Sunny to collect, along with what seems to be a wall of family portraits behind the chair, with all the individual faces on the portraits scribbled out in black. Similar to how Sunny scribbled out the faces in Basil's photo album, because these are both coping mechanisms. These are both ways Sunny deals with his grief. Just another way to forget Mari, to try and flee his past. Note that the sliding door is radiating red, similar to the window that Sunny was, quote, strangely drawn to. This entire room is actually red, likely because of the red radiating from the door, but like I said, red is only becoming more abundant as we continue. Anyway, Sunny picks up the photo in the middle of the room, and we see that it's a picture of when Sunny pushed Mari down the stairs. Once you take the photo, the sliding door behind you suddenly opens. Once you go through it, you're greeted by a long path, with several gates for Sunny to go through and more photos to collect. At this point, the entire surrounding scenery is covered in red, along with Sunny himself progressively being covered in more blood. We know that the reason for this overwhelming tint of red is because of what this path leads to, the tree that Mari was hung on. Once we approach the tree, we can see the final photo needed to complete the photo album leaning up against the tree. Note that at this point, the skybox is radiating red so brightly, it's even covering a little bit of the tree. At the ultimate moment of truth in the game, red has an almost encapsulating presence, almost like a chokehold over the color palette. Once you pick up the final photo, a montage of all the photos you've collected will slowly play, telling the full story of what happened on that day. But at the final frame, we see something. No pun intended, by the way. We see Mari's right eye staring at us through her long hair. This is the last look that Sunny ever got of Mari. It's cemented in his brain in the form of something, as the picture is quickly replaced with a flashing of Sunny's something. This entire time, Sunny's something has been his last look at Mari. This something figure that's been haunting him for the entire duration of the game has just been a latent manifestation of Mari's corpse. Her visible eye staring at him and haunting him wherever he goes. This isn't just like a figure of speech, by the way. I genuinely believe that that's an intentional part of the design. The eye is meant to represent how Sunny feels like Mari is watching him. The idea of Mari watching Sunny live his life after what he did is the ultimate guilt for Sunny. He doesn't feel like he has the right to live after what he did, hence all the references to suicide throughout the game. Similar to the something is Hell Mari. However, instead of trauma, Hell Mari represents the guilt Sunny feels. Hell Mari is a way to demonize Mari and repress her natural charismatic personality, which is caring, loving, and extremely forgiving. A big one being unconditional love for Sunny. With all these personality traits, it'd be very difficult to repress her in Sunny's mind. These personality traits don't feed into Sunny's guilt. That's the purpose of Hell Mari. To demonize Mari. To make her seem like some sort of spirit that's haunting Sunny. Therefore, making her easier to repress in his mind. So this will be the end of the video. Before anything, I do want to mention, yes, throughout most of this video, I did use the wrong pronouns for Basil, because Basil just looks like a fucking woman, bro. Like I can't take myself seriously calling Basil a he, him. Like, just come on, bro. So before anything, I just wanted to say that. I'm sorry, but I like, if I made the attempt to correct myself throughout the recording of this 30-40 minute video, it would just take up too much of my time and brain power. But regardless of this, Omori was honestly one of my favorite games of all time. Without a doubt, one of the best ever psychological horror experiences I've ever had, and probably will ever have. While I do think horror is an exaggeration, the game is more of a thriller, in my opinion at least. And I say this as someone who's kind of a bitch, and like, horror scares me a lot, but that's not the point. I think Omori did a really great job with the nuance of the storytelling and adding a lot of subtleties to add to your understanding of the story, while still being a little on the nose at some points. So very good at being implicit, but also explicit at a lot of key points. Now Omori is so good at this and so detailed that I might even make a second video. About what? I'm not sure yet, but I do have a lot of notes for a video on the Basil boss fight, which I think is so detailed it can be analyzed in its own video. Now the video wouldn't be as long as this video, but it'd still be its own full-length video. Now regardless of this, I do lack sufficient material for a conclusion, since there's no concluding or blanket premise in this video. However, the original reason that I even started writing this video 2.5 years ago was because after I finished Omori, I couldn't help but appreciate the detail and the nuance and the sheer amount of content you get for its price tag. So I guess if there's any one thing to take away from this video, is that with Omori, I've barely scratched the surface. There's still so much more content to cover, which I will likely never cover, even if I do make another video. It's currently September 22nd, 2024. I finished Omori in March of 2021, and started writing this video in early 2022, so around April 2022. It's been almost 3 years, or to be more specific, 2.5 years. And even then, in this 40-ish minute video, I think it's around 40 minutes, I couldn't cover everything that I've wanted to cover. Because as I was making this video, I discovered so many more things about the game that I didn't know before. So you know, with all the time and effort and the portion of my teenage life that I've spent making this video, to conclude, or rather in conclusion, for the amount of content that Omori has and at its price tag, Omori's pretty tight. Omori's pretty fire. By far the best horror experience I've ever had in gaming, and maybe in general because I just don't consume that much horror. But yeah, I've put a lot of effort into this video, so it's weird to be recording the conclusion. See you guys in the next one. Bye! Fuck!